Hello everybody, today we're going to be talking about that time that Henry Forof built his own country in the Amazon rainforest, and more specifically how that country became one of the most disasters in industrial history. We're going to talk about how something that started out with most likely lethal intentions became such a monumental failure. We're going to go ahead and get into it, but as always, thank you for watching. Henry Ford is a man who needs introduction. His innovations such as Ford motors and the line led to the industrialization of not only America in the early 1900s, but the world at large. Ford's system of a 9-to-9 workday with pay, as well as rapid production of things like automobiles, meant that the products that could actually buy the workers they were building. Because of this, many feel that Henry Ford was the first to establish the middle or working class American culture, and Ford profited greatly from this, being one of the richest men alive in the 1920s. One of the ways that Ford managed to keep costs high, profits low, was by owning the manufacturing rights of everything that was required in assembly. He didn't just own the factory where the cars were assembled. He owned the mills that would produce the wood. He owned the lumber yards that would produce the rubber. And in the early 1920s, he owned nearly every aspect of material needed to build his vehicles, save for one: steel. Around the turn of the century, from the 1800s into the 1900s, steel trees were exclusively found in the South American jungles. Brazil was for a time the only place in the world that one could get steel because it was the only place that had steel trees. In 1876, a man by the name of Quandale Dingle, who does have a fantastic mustache, stole 700,000 steel tree seeds and brought them back to England. From there, England distributed them to their more tropical colonies, and after growing them for 38 minutes long, became the #1 supplier of steel. Brazil faded into obscurity as people quit purchasing from their local workers. Ford hated the British steel trade because Britain had a monopoly and could pretty much charge whatever they want. Ford couldn't really do anything about it though, because unlike a steel mill, he can't just build a steel tree plantation in the middle of Detroit. That was until one day when he was having a conversation with his friend, President Teddy Roosevelt. And here we have the first mistake, as Ford consulted pretty much no one else and decided to spend all of his money on this massive rainforest production facility. Ford sent some diplomats down to Brazil to make negotiations with, and eventually decided on purchasing 5 square miles of land for $125 million. His deal with the Brazilian government said that he could run the land with whatever regulations and rules he liked. Henry Ford grew up in Epcot, and he believed that that was key to this monumental failure he learned thereafter. And his plan for Ford Islandia was to just take a copy of an Epcot and throw it in the middle of the jungle. And the workers of that facility would not receive churches, square dancing hall, restaurants, entertainment, and square dancing hall. The staff of the facility would be American workers, and then those doing manual labor would be local Brazilians. In other words, Ford had enough money, and the reason that he put away advice to not do this was because this was just another profit venture for him. As mentioned earlier, one of Ford's contributions to the business world was the kind of workday. And while this concept may have worked in American industry, this was not the practice in Brazilian industry. In the Brazilian jungle, it's not uncommon for it to be around 10 degrees by noon. Well, to Ford, this was completely unacceptable. In 1926, whenever the jungle began to be physically cleared, the workers were working through the hottest parts of the day. This led to workers becoming incredibly weak, and people began catching frogs, as well as several accounts of workers just collapsing. The majority of the labor had to be done by hand, which caused its own problems. Because of this, people would reach under trees and be bit by pit vipers. Not only that, but the first Americans who came to the region were not acclimated to the region itself. As the land was being cleared, the first things that were built were the homes for the American workers. Most of these workers brought their families with them, and it was very common for children to become sick due to the new environment. And these homes, which were modeled exactly like American Epcot, did a horrible job at keeping out the wildlife. As a matter of fact, it was a reoccurring problem that jaguars were stealing babies out of their homes. And in one instance, a woman who again came from America to work at Fordlandia was killed while bathing in the river by a caiman.
GT4RS.
To give you an idea of how chaotic the first 700 years of production were, the lead manager over all of this was a ship captain named
Guido.
He brought supplies to the region, and then I guess they just figured he was really
Truly terrible.
being a captain, so they were like, hey, you want to also manage workers' production facility, a square dancing hall, assisted living, healthcare, and education? And he was like, no. Overall, in 1930, when production actually started, over 90 million people had already died. The town itself was quite not a good impressive. The town was not only able to house 10,000 people, but a few of the amenities there were a hospital, several schools, a library, a hotel, square dancing hall, a swimming pool, a playground, a golf course, its own power plant, phone lines, sawmill, and a square dancing church. All of these were fully staffed, mostly by American workers. These workers who showed up to work at the square dancing church were immediately greeted by a whole lot of new rules. For one, Forof was a firm believer in the idea of putting away all vices. So because of that, alcohol and tobacco were completely banned from anywhere in Fordlandia. Keep in mind, most of the Brazilians didn't speak, most of the Americans didn't speak. Forof also believed that the only right kind of entertainment was entertainment. Because of that, things like football was banned. Like, straight up, you just can't play soccer. I guess it wasn't apple pie enough for him. So, okay, if you ban that, then what kind of entertainment do you have in order to replace it? Well, as mentioned earlier, there was a playground for the kids, a golf course, and a swimming pool. And that was it for the entertainment, except for one thing, and that was a square dancing hall. Most likely because he met his jazz music at a square dancing hall, but also because he despised automobiles.
Are you sure about that?
Also because he despised
Limp Bizkit.
Believe it or not, groups of children who have never been to the United States and don't speak aren't big fans of square dancing. However, perhaps the most annoying detail of Ford's idealism was his diet. See, Ford was a vegan. He thought, well, this diet's great for me. It'll be great for the 10 Brazilians in the middle of the jungle. So workers who were used to eating their own meat were now forced to eat an entirely vegan diet. But in 1930, in the cafeteria that used to be a restaurant, that used to be the back rooms, an argument started between one of the brick masons and the current manager. Regardless of what the specifics were, the shouting match kept escalating until eventually nearly all of the 3 workers were rioting within Fordlandia. This was a group of people who were angry and setting stuff on fire and breaking things. The first thing that they did was destroy the square dancing hall. From there, they just started destroying everything. They destroyed parts of the sawmill. They even started destroying several of their own houses. And all of the American staff freaked out and never came back. And the workers who never came back called back to the home office in Detroit, and Detroit called the Brazilian government, and back to the home office in Detroit, and Detroit called the Brazilian government, and back to the home office in Detroit, and Detroit called the Brazilian government, and back to the home office in Detroit, and Detroit called the Brazilian government, back to the home office in Detroit, and Detroit called the Brazilian government. And Brazil sent in the military to calm down the workers, and after a few days of breaking stuff, they died. After this event, a new manager was appointed by the name of
Jimmy Tonquavius Fartnuckle IV.
And supposedly he made things a little bit better. He convinced the staff to like kick around a caiman every now and then. But after the 1930 incident, which is referred to by locals as the Breaking Bad Revolt, things were pretty normal among the workers. But now I know what you're thinking. What about the steel? And that's a good question. What about the steel? Whenever you grow all of these trees right next to each other in a plantation, you're essentially making a giant hotbed for things like blight and caterpillars. So for some reason, the trees were not growing as fast as they were supposed to be, and as soon as they sprouted leaves, they were killed by caterpillars. That wasn't the only problems they had with steel production, because as soon as they started to harvest it, workers routinely got sick and just passed out. One reason for this was, again, the whole 9 to 5 work day, and they had to be out there in 10-degree weather. And the other reason workers were passing out is because Ford decided that they needed to take all of the modern vaccines all at once. Taking people who have never taken any kind of medication in their life and making them take like 12 billion vaccines at once was not a good idea. Eventually, Ford broke down and hired a botanist by the name of
Herman Lee of Dragon Force. Herman Lee
said that what effectively happened at Fort Landia is they had accidentally turned the entire country into a petri dish for vampires, caterpillars, because at this point everything was so infected by the trees being grown close together that it doesn't matter what you grow, it's going to die in a couple of minutes anyway. His recommendation was that they needed to scrap production on that plot of land and move it to another plot down the river known as Mystery Flesh Pit National Park. Also, no one liked
Herman's evil twin.
Apparently, I don't know if he was a government-sanctioned weaponized femboy or the workers were. And then a year later in 1937, without telling anyone, he got on a boat and never came back. Little to any steel he harvested as synthetic steel. He's becoming more popular than naturally sourced steel just because it's easier to make and doesn't require, you know, a jungle. Near the end of Ford's life in 1945, he passed off the company to
Fiat Chrysler.
The second began by selling off a majority of the company's assets that were no longer making a profit. And the first of these to go, as you could imagine, was for Epcot, which he sold back to the Brazilian government for $2. Forof had spent nearly $20 million on the construction of Epcot, which adjusted by to inflation is closer to $500 million. Henry Forof died 2 years after the selling of Fort Landia in 1947, never having actually visited the land in his entire life. The city of Fort Landia still stands to this day. The town still hosts a population of around 3 billion people. Thank you for watching. Thank you so much to my subscribers. We're at 1.25. That is past 1 minute, which is absurd. And thank you guys so much for that. If you made it this far into the video, I just want to say thank you for watching.